Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the disposal of Fukushima's tritiated water. And the first thing to mention is that in the 1950s, when the nuclear industry started discharges of very large quantities of liquid radioactive waste to sea, it had no knowledge of the way radioactivity would behave in marine environments. So, in the absence of any scientific data, the nuclear industry came up with a hypothesis that liquid tritium as tritiated water was of low biological significance because it had a short half-life. It would dissolve into infinity once in the marine environment, and it was a low activity radioactive emitter, which they assumed would generate very low doses from the consumption of fish only. This hypothesis quickly became fossilized as a nuclear orthodoxy, despite the absence of scientific evidence to support it. Because the greatest volume of aggregated radioactivity, as measured in terms of terabecquerels, discharged to sea from most nuclear reactors does actually consist of tritiated water, the defense of this orthodoxy has been of huge importance to the nuclear industry. However, their claim that tritium is of low radiological significance has now been shown to be comprehensively inaccurate, but sadly the industry refuses to adopt the outcomes of recent scientific studies, which have contradicted pretty much every aspect of the official position. So particularly post the 1990s, research published in peer-reviewed journals has conclusively proved that the tritium in discharged water quickly becomes incorporated into the cells of organic, plant, and microorganic material in marine environments. That research has proved that organically bound tritium, or OBT, accumulates in fine sediments suspended in the water column or deposited in mudflats, especially those mudflats with a high percentage of organic material, where the OBT can be enriched in the sediment by up to 250 times greater than the concentrations found in the ambient seawater. Marine animals which consume this organic material accumulate OBT at a faster rate than those exposed only to tritiated water. As a result, organically bound tritium is far more biologically mobile through marine food webs than non-organically bound tritium. So organically bound tritium is most highly bioaccumulated in species near the apex of the marine consumers, such as predatory fish and sea mammals. Such species typically hold concentrations between 2,000 and 6,000 times greater than the concentrations found in the ambient water, but they have been shown to reach up to 61,000 becquerels to the kilogram in some species. Organically bound tritium also has a far longer half-life within biological entities and is more persistent in the environment than tritium as tritiated water. So it's clear that organically bound tritium is of far greater dose significance than tritiated water, and it's also clear that there is significant risk of elevated human dietary doses of marine sourced tritium via seafoods and organically bound tritium. As far back as 2009, independent research published in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity commented that nuclear industry recommendations and advice on the dosimetric significance of tritiated water was not supported by the evidence and definitely required a reconsideration. However, it's clear from the current propaganda from the pro-nuclear industry lobbyists who propose the discharge at Fukushima that these concerns and comments have not been acted upon and the nuclear interests have not reconsidered their position or acted on the new evidence. So clearly, in the context of the information I've just shared with you, there is a very high potential for seafood consumers to receive significant dietary doses of tritium in its organically bound form from the consumption of both marine plant and animal products. Independent researchers now confirm that the seafood dietary pathway, however, is not the only way that human populations may receive doses of tritium and organically bound tritium. Because it is part of the nuclear orthodoxy that tritium, as tritiated water, dissolves in seawater, the industry has failed to conduct any research on the implications of this fact. However, research on the behavior and fate of other soluble radioisotopes and those which bond to organic marine microparticles provides a powerful indication of the behavior and fate of tritium and organically bound tritium in marine and coastal environments. In the UK, studies have clearly shown repeatedly that coastal pastures washed and flooded by high tide and storm surge become heavily contaminated with soluble and organically bonded radioactivity. And this has been proved to deliver dietary doses of marine radioactivity through the consumption of dairy and meat products from animals reared on tide-washed pastures. Similarly, when coastal and urban industrial environments have been flooded by storm surge and high tide events, many thousands of tons of marine water and sediment containing soluble and particle incorporated radioactivity have exposed both residents and cleanup crews to significant doses via contact and inhalation pathways. Another significant tritium and organically bound tritium dose pathway, clearly demonstrated by the behavior of soluble and organic particle radioactivity studied in the UK, is the sea to land transfer of marine aerosols and sea spray generated in the surf zone and blown at least 10 miles inland. This mechanism is proved to deposit soluble radioactivity onto pasture grass and other crops from where it enters the agricultural food chain and delivers doses to human consumers at least 10 miles inland. Given the fact that this airborne sea spray and marine aerosols laden with soluble radioactivity is clearly shown to penetrate up to 10 miles into the terrestrial coastal zone, it appears inevitable that coastal zone populations will also be exposed to inhalation doses of airborne radioactivity. Under conditions of prevailing onshore winds on the UK Atlantic coast, this sea spray and marine aerosol sea to land pathway has been estimated to operate for over 50% of the year. And it seems quite likely that on the Honshu coast of the Pacific Ocean, that similar mechanisms will prevail. So much PR has been given to the TEPCO claims that other radionuclides have been filtered out of the stored water, but this has failed to point out that the process cannot remove all of the other radionuclides. There is a broad consensus amongst independent workers that the water will still contain detectable quantities of strontium-90, cobalt-60, iodine-129, ruthenium-106, cesium-137, and carbon-14. And that around 70% of the water still requires additional cleaning. This should not be forgotten when discussing the proposal to sea dump the stored tritiated water. As an example of the impact of sea to land transfer mechanisms, we can look at a review of a study carried out in the UK coastal zone between 1979 and 1985. When a medical team composed of GPs, a hospital medical consultant, a senior hospital medical registrar, and a medical statistician carried out research on the body concentration of cesium-137 in subjects from the islands of North Uist off the west coast of Scotland. Now, North Uist is approximately 250 kilometres downstream of the Sellafield reprocessor site. Sea discharged radioactive wastes are discharged from Sellafield and transported through the Hebridean Island group and past North Uist by a strong northward flowing current. The research on the island made use of whole body analysis at the Scottish University's Research Reactor Centre and 96-hour gamma counting analysis of subjects' urine and dietary intake, including island-grown milk, lamb, fish, seaweed, vegetables, pasture grass, and wild vegetation. This is the only dietary dose assessment study which I have ever come across where such a wealth of actual empirical data has been deployed. Almost all of these studies that I've seen are based on largely hypothetical model data using a less effective 15-hour gamma count. The research on the island of North Uist found that the island environment, from the rich coastal farmlands through to the uncultivated moorland of the interior, was contaminated with cesium-137. Cesium-137 was found in island seaweeds used as fertilizer and animal feed, and in wild foods such as venison and mushrooms, and in the island peat used for domestic fuel. Cesium-137 was found in all samples analysed. Foodstuff concentrations were higher in island-grown foodstuffs than in their mainland equivalents. The radiological fingerprint ratio of cesium-137 to cesium-134 clearly implicated the Sellafield sea discharge as a source of the cesium that was being found. And the cesium was clearly transferred from the sea to land via the range of mechanisms that I discussed earlier. It was found that the cesium concentrations in islander urine was 6 times higher than in the mainland controls. And the islanders had 5 times higher body concentrations of cesium-137 than the mainland control subjects. It was found that the islander with the highest body concentration of Sellafield sea-derived cesium-137 ate no fish or seafood, but lived within 50 meters of the coast and farmed sheep and dairy and beef cattle with access to coastal grassland, inland grassland, and the shoreline. Islanders who consumed greater amounts of island-grown produce were shown to have higher body concentrations of Sellafield-derived cesium-137 than those who consumed greater amounts of imported shock food. Half of the 30 local coastal critic groups living next to UK nuclear sites with liquid radioactive discharges and receiving doses of multiple nuclides from usually calculated for 7 or more, received dietary doses from seafood lower than 10 microsieverts. By comparison, the average islander in the North US study exposure to marine-sourced dietary cesium alone via terrestrial foodstuffs was 13.7 microsieverts per year. So I think that kind of comparison gives you an idea of how serious and important the sea to land transfer mechanisms can be in terms of dose. Right, so there's the background to the discharges. Let's have a look at the actual parameters that control the movement of any radioactivity discharge from Fukushima. So the major influence there is the Oyashio current. This Oyashio is a strong, coherent southward flowing current carrying polar water close inshore along the entire 250-kilometer length of the Pacific coast of Honshu. It's highly relevant in the context of the organic bonding of tritium to note that the Oyashio current is rich in organic material. In general, the Honshu coast to the south of Fukushima consists of a narrow coastal plain backed by higher ground from which a number of rivers carrying yet more organically rich sediment flow east into the Pacific to join the Oyashio. Where it's not urban or industrialized, significant areas of the coastal zone are agricultural. So urbanization of almost all of the river deltas along that coastline with extensive land reclamation and port development mean that many of those rivers no longer have recognizable delta systems and shoreline fine sediment deposits like mudflats and salt marshes. The unbroken nature of this coast with few sheltered low energy environments where fine sediments can be deposited also means that as a result of these factors, the coherent and southward moving Oyashio current carries very high levels of mineral and organic fine sediments, which are unable to deposit out in the coastline environment. This means that the Oyashio is very suitable for the formation and transport of organically bound tritium. Clearly, consumers of seaweeds, fish and mammals raised in the Oyashio environment will be exposed to significant and detectable dietary doses of both tritiated water and organically bound tritium. In addition, during periods of onshore wind and enhanced wave activity, the Honshu coasts downstream and south of Fukushima will also be subject to sea-to-land transfer of tritium as both tritiated water and OBT in aerosols and sea spray and in episodes of coastal flooding. Prolonged periods of onshore wind are a strong feature of the annual meteorological cycle, and the east coast of Honshu, as everybody will know, is a victim of numerous tropical cyclonic storms. I have no idea of the data on the percentage of the year in which relevant onshore onshore wind speeds with speeds in excess of 10 kilometers per hour will blow onto this coast. But since these are prevailing winds, I would expect the percentage to be pretty high. So, such sea-to-land transfer of marine sea sprays and aerosols will deliver both dietary and inhalation doses to coastal zone populations at least 10 miles inland from the Honshu coast via the mechanisms discussed earlier. Pacific coast of Honshu is subject to frequent coastal flooding events, which can impact both agricultural and urban areas. And this parameter will also generate dietary, contact, and inhalation doses of tritiated water and OBT. And of course, the other radionuclides which haven't been scrubbed out of that water. In the context of the evidence summarized above, I can confirm that the release of the massive quantities of Fukushima's stored water has the potential to deliver significant and major inhalation and dietary doses to Honshu coastal zone populations. These populations have already been in receipt of earlier post-meltdown Fukushima doses from the marine environment, and the proposed release of the stored liquids will only exacerbate this plight. It is a fact that Japanese and nuclear authorities have not researched the historical impacts on Honshu distant coastal communities and their environments, and this strongly implies that they will not conduct any such investigations after dumping the tritiated water as proposed. These groups along the Honshu coast have already been abandoned by nuclear science, and it seems highly likely that they will soon be sacrificial victims to the nuclear industry's need and desire to get rid of Fukushima's millions of gallons of tritiated water. Thank you for listening.